I could ask people to please sit down. We're going to start our celebration. Let me welcome you all to this very special birthday party. When we say it's a rare event that we celebrate somebody who is 90 years young, it of course is. I want to thank Houghton Mifflin and Nader Darashori for co-sponsoring and co-hosting this evening with us here at the Kennedy School. And I'd also like to apologize to guests who are on the second and third floor, but Ken is so popular that we've had an overflow crowd, and we hope that everybody will have a chance to greet him at some point of the evening. The program, the main program, which Marvin Kalb will moderate in his wonderful mellifluous tones, will start after we finish the main course. But I wanted to start us off with a toast of my own on behalf of the Kennedy School. The mission of the Kennedy School is to train people for public leadership and to do research that contributes to the solution of public problems. And in that sense, Ken Galbraith is a role model for all of us. He represents the commitment to scholarship, public service, and humane ideals that's an example that we hope that the graduates of this institution will follow. And from the forum in which he has spoken many times and inspired us on many occasions, and within the Kennedy School for which he served as a founding father and guiding light, I want to offer a toast of appreciation to Ken on his 90th birthday. And I can think of no better way to do it than to repeat the citation which Ken received in 1988 when Harvard gave him an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws. And the citation that Derek Bach then read out as we reconfer that honorary degree tonight was economist, social critic, man of letters whose writings provoke and inform. After 50 years, as it was then, he stands tall in Cambridge. Ken, happy birthday. And now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel, President of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, to make a special announcement of his own. Bill.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. At a dinner just a year ago this evening, in the process of celebrating our chairman's 80th birthday, the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute established the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Award in American History and Public Commentary to recall to future generations the importance of understanding our country's history so as to support and defend the constitutional principles of the American Republic. The award is a prize of $25,000. The recipient to be chosen by a committee of selectors, namely John Morton Blum, the Sterling Professor Emeritus of History at Yale, Doris Kearns Goodwin, noted biographer, political scientist, and historian, and Walter Cronkite, whose eminent voice in public affairs has earned him the admiration of the nation. Recalling the considerations that impelled the naming of the award for Arthur Schlesinger, the selectors were asked to take note of the nominees' achievements in the fields of history and biography, emphasizing the contemporary relevance and literary distinction of their work, of the contributions of pungent and informed analysis relating to questions of public policy, of a nominee's role as a teacher, whether in academia or at public lectures or debates and discussions, of his contributions as a critic, commentator, and journalist, and of the nominee's respect for the obligations, responsibilities, and opportunities of public service, as reflected in service to the United States in both war and peace. We trustees of the Roosevelt Institute assumed, of course, that we had given the selectors an impossible task, allowing us thereby to invest the endowment of this award in the infinite bull market, thereby permitting the accrual of funds into the millennium, thereby creating a financial cache that would rival the Nobel Prize. But disaster has struck. Happily, our funds are wisely and intelligently invested, but the selectors have informed us that they have found an extraordinary nominee whom they have recommended for this award in 1998. They report that their recommended recipient has written 43 books, which have profoundly influenced our understanding of modern society. They say that as recently as last Monday, he published yet another op-ed cannonade, capping more than 60 years of powerful, persuasive efforts based on incomparable historical erudition to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted in the pursuit of social justice. That he is the century's best-known professor at one of our greatest universities. That the fact that he has served as president of both the American Economic Association and the American Academy of Arts and Letters reflects the breadth of his talents and influence. That his career defines the obligations and opportunity of public service, having been a creative part of the New Deal and later by appointment of President Kennedy, America's ambassador to India. And he has done all this and much more, the selectors report, with urbanity, optimism, devastating wit and humor, and memorable modesty. On the basis of the selectors' recommendation, the Roosevelt Institute hereby designates John Kenneth Galbraith, the 1998 recipient of the Arthur M. Schlesinger Award in American History and Public Commentary, and herewith award him $25,000.
Again, welcome. Enjoy your dinner. Near the end of the main course, Marvin Kalb will start the main program. Bon appetit.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention. Good evening. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And it is my great pleasure, indeed my great honor, to have been selected as Master of Ceremonies of this illustrious gathering, here to honor John Kenneth Galbraith on his 90th birthday. Galbraith, the contemporary Renaissance man. Ken, I want to thank you on behalf first of the Kalb family for launching two careers. The career first of my brother, Bernard Kalb, as a television correspondent. You will remember in 1962 in Sikkim, a protectorate of India, the country to which you were accredited as ambassador. My brother went there accredited to CBS, and there was the wedding of the American socialite Hope Cook to the Maharaja of Sikkim. Bernie took all of these pictures for CBS, and there was Ken Galbraith arriving in white tie, top hat, and fitting in magnificently in the Himalayan mountains. And when Bernie was finished with all of his pictures, he wanted to do his stand-upper. And he needed a white tie and a top hat. He wanted to be in the spirit of it all. And you may not remember it, but you were gracious enough to give him, literally, the jacket off your back. And what he did at that time was perform. It ran for 4 minutes on Cronkite News that night, and the career was then launched. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And then I want to point out also that you helped me launch my modest career here at the Kennedy School. You'll remember this story, I hope it was 1987, and I was arriving for my first lecture, and you spotted me out here in the courtyard, and you said, "Marvin, what's wrong? You look absolutely green." I said, "Well, you know, this is my first lecture as a Harvard professor. I mean, that's a big deal." And you said, "No, no, no. It's not that much of a big deal." Every Harvard professor knows the old rule of thumb here, that there is no subject so awesome, so complicated, so involved, that it cannot be reduced to a 50-minute lecture. And at the same time, there is no subject, you added, that is so trivial, so totally unimportant, so dismissible, that a Harvard professor cannot inflate it into a 50-minute lecture. But I have no intention of inflating anything tonight. The occasion really speaks for itself. And all of you are most welcome indeed to the Kennedy School of Government, and really here to honor Ken Galbraith. What I would like to do first is single out members of the Galbraith family who have traveled great distances to be with us tonight. I'd like to call out names of the inner Galbraith clan, ask them to stand, and then let's applaud them when all of the names have been called. First, Kitty Galbraith. Hold on just a sec. Let's get everybody called. And then Sister Catherine Denholm, who's come in from Toronto. Catherine. Son James and his wife Ying, who've come in from Texas. Son Alan and his wife Sarah, who have come in from Washington. San Francisco, corrected. And son Peter and his wife Tuna, who have also come in from Washington. Please stand up, and now we can all give them a great hand. Thank you. Let me also mention other Galbraith family members who are with us. They don't have to stand, and you don't have to really applaud. The nephews, Ron and Jerry, grandchildren, Margaret, Douglas, Katie, Jean, and David. Grandnephew, Michael. Welcome to you all. The theme tonight is Galbraith, the Contemporary Renaissance Man. And just to expand on Dean Nye's opening point about Galbraith's contribution to public service, Ken Galbraith started here as a professor of economics 6 decades ago. And he recognized, however, that there was a world outside of Harvard, hard as that might have been for many other members of the faculty to recognize. And Galbraith plunged into the Washington of World War II. Then he took his hand at a form of journalism. In the 60s, with the new frontier beckoning, he entered diplomacy, spent rich and rewarding years in India. Then, with Vietnam boiling, he re-entered politics, the '68 campaign. And through it all, he kept writing and teaching and writing and teaching, always having in mind somehow taking the theory of the classroom and applying it to the reality of the world, and then taking the world and bringing it back into the classroom. And if you can accomplish that, you are one great public servant and one great teacher. He has truly emerged as the contemporary Renaissance man, and he is the man we all honor tonight. Happy birthday, Ken Galbraith. We've asked a number of close friends and family members to offer some personal reflections and reminiscences live and on videotape to illustrate the many ways in which Galbraith has contributed to our lives. I'd like first to introduce the chairman, the president, and the chief executive officer of Houghton Mifflin, the co-sponsor of tonight's party, Nader Darashuri, to begin with some reflections on Galbraith, the author. Nader.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. It gives me great pleasure to be here tonight to join all of you in honoring John Kenneth Galbraith on the occasion of his 90th birthday. So many of you were with us 5 years ago when we celebrated Ken's 85th birthday. Like Ken, we must all acknowledge that we are 5 years older now than we were then. But in that time, Ken has written 2 books and probably done a number of other great deeds that we at Houghton Mifflin are less aware of. How many of us can match his place? There is just too much of Ken for one person to measure. So several of us are going to try to look at him from different perspectives. Wendy Stratman, head of our Trade and Reference Division, will tell you about the significance of Ken's books and the effects they have had on their millions of readers. But I want to talk very briefly about what it has been like to be Ken's publisher. All publishers know the unique relationship that is formed between themselves and their authors. There is a wonderful mutuality to this relationship, such that one's success is enjoyed by the other, and any pain is also shared with a similar but more ruthless suddenness. But this is the general situation. When we at Houghton Mifflin talk about Ken, we are talking about a most unique, most particular situation. That he has done 32 books with us by itself could be either a blessing or a curse. Of course, if he had not been so successful, we would not have published so many of his books. So in Ken's case, it has been most definitely a blessing. The number of books he has written is a tribute not only to how much he has to say, but to how many want to listen. This is true because Ken has an uncanny ability to engage the reader and to explain the working of economy not solely in terms of numbers, graphs, and economic man, but rather in a ways that it speaks directly to human strength and frailties. And the irrational needs that underlie both the choices we make and the economic remedies we must seek. In accomplishing this, Ken has made economics accessible to the many, not just the few. He has done more than anyone else to make society economically literate. How can I convey the pride we feel in being so strongly associated with Ken Galbraith? How can I acknowledge the countless numbers of times readers have read something Ken wrote, felt the effect of his insight or his humor, and then paused and turned from the page to check the spine to see what good publisher had put this wonderful work into print. How many readers did Ken introduce us to on such a complimentary terms? And how many wonderful authors did he inspire to be published by our company as well? And some of you are in this group tonight. It is the publisher's privilege to share deeply in the success of authors. but no other author has ever accorded any publisher a greater share of his displeasure than Houghton Mifflin has enjoyed in being your publisher, Ken. We wish you the happiest of birthdays, and we look forward with great anticipation to celebrating your 95th birthday in year 2003. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neda, very much. When I first arrived tonight, I wanted to find out exactly how many books Galbraith has written. So I turned to my first source. I said, how many? And she said, 47. I said, wow. Then I came upon Nader at one point, and I said, how many, Nader? He said 33 then, but 32 in his prepared comments. And then I turned to someone else and said, how many? And I was told 43. So I said I had best check with the man himself. How many, I asked Ken. He said, oh, I don't know, 40 or 50. Now to offer some comments, some remarks on Galbraith's very special place at Harvard University, and who better than the president of the university, Neil Rudenstine. President Rudenstine.
Good evening, everyone. Ken and I and Angelica and Kitty met for the first time and dined together as a quartet in the autumn of 1991, soon after Angelica and I returned to Harvard and Cambridge after a lapse of about 20 years. So I can't speak with any first-hand knowledge about anything that happened during the first 83 years of Ken's several lives and careers. I only know, for instance, from quite reliable secondary sources that Ken managed his shift from youth to official manhood brilliantly. It coincided perfectly with the most spectacular of the many seismic tectonic events of 1929. On October 15, 1929, Ken's 21st birthday, there was a spontaneous celebratory chorus of public good cheer from major figures in the financial world. Charles E. Mitchell and Professor Irving Fisher declared that the United States economy was more or less indestructible, and that the stock market was poised once again to rise euphorically. Within 100 hours of Ken's 21st birthday, when the last traces of icing on the cake had scarcely had time to deliquesce, the United States Secretary of Commerce said that he was having a difficult time finding the $100,000 in public funds that would be required to pay for the upkeep of the yacht Corsair, which J.P. Morgan had just given to the nation. Within another couple hundred hours, the New York Stock Exchange had essentially disappeared into a black hole, plummeting right the way through its worst day in recorded history. Ken's market timing has, of course, always been faultless. And so it was that our lean Galbraithian hero, barely moments after attaining his majority, toppled the house and capsized the yacht of Morgan, blasted the money changers from the temple, and cleansed what little remained in the O'Gahn stables at the heart of Lower Manhattan's stock and bond yards. This long ago battle with madness in the markets has been on my mind, not only because I recently reread Ken's marvelous book on the Great Crash. In fact, the specific references that I just mentioned come from that volume, but also because two of Ken's most recent works, both written this October on the brink of this birthday, happen to be on the very same great crashing subject. The first of these pieces was, of course, his elegant New York Times op-ed essay just a few days ago. The second is an unpublished letter to me. It arrived about 200 hours ago, and it has to do with our modest university endowment, as viewed in the light of recent market disturbances. Our institutional net worth, Ken seemed to be suggesting in his letter, might just possibly be mutable, and it was not necessarily predestined to be always upwardly mobile. But what struck me most about the letter was the fact that while the theme was certainly a familiar one, the other 4 letters from Ken to me are all on the same subject. The style was anything but Ken's public Enlightenment voice, a voice in the approximate range of a 20th century Voltaire, if such a thing can be imagined. Instead, there was something more comradely, almost solicitous about the tone of Ken's letter. A sort of, watch out, don't let yourself get hedged in or out. This companionable message, this uncondescending solicitousness, this concern really for the institution and the people who comprise it, all of these nuances and inflections, as well as others, seem suddenly to epitomize what Angelica and I have been fortunate enough to experience in our all too brief friendship with Ken and Kitty these past few years. And we have felt immeasurably enriched as well as buoyed by what they have given us. So, when I see Ken striding toward Widener Library or the faculty club, his head above the treetops, I feel reassured that the spirit of the university is happily abroad in the yard. The sanity and the great good sense, the irony and the wit, the edge, the clarity, the skepticism, and the conviction, as well as the sense of affectionate identity with Harvard. I feel reassured that all these qualities and relationships are still vital and present, embodied kinetically in this remarkable person who is celebrating not only his birthday, but also his 50th anniversary as a tenured member of the Harvard faculty. Our Paul M. Warburg Professor of Economics Emeritus. So to Ken, a toast to your constancy, whether to friends, to Harvard, or to Houghton Mifflin, or others, to your persistent vision and your unwillingness to forget those in our society who are, for whatever reason, disenfranchised and disinherited. To this evening, which finds you surrounded by so many who care so much about you and about Kitty. On the eve of this, your 90th, let me simply say that the shrewdest eye discerns no sign you are no longer 89. Ken, happy birthday.
Thank you very much, sir. And now another perspective. We'd like the perspective of young people, perhaps representing youth and the future generations around Harvard. The Galbraith presence, the legend, the legacy on this campus has already affected and will continue to affect many of the young people who come through. And we have asked someone, a member of the Harvard class of 2001, Mark Stad, to come to the stage and speak. He's a government major at Harvard College. He's from LA, is involved in the Harvard-Radcliffe College Democrats and the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School. Mark Stad.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me here tonight. Professor Galbraith was once quoted as saying, "There are few ironclad rules of diplomacy, but to one there is no exception. When an official reports that talks were useful, it can safely be concluded that nothing was accomplished." It was these two lines that gave me comfort in formulating my speech, because it took away the burden of having to say something of consequence or usefulness. I'm here to talk about Galbraith as teacher. While I could spend the next hour telling you about a man that has taught thousands of undergraduates about supply and demand curves or the variables that affect our GDP, I feel that Galbraith has been a lot more than simply Harvard's most famous professor. Professor Galbraith is the perennial teacher, a man who has taught and will continue to educate many generations to come. How else could I, a 19-year-old sophomore, someone who's never taken your class, learn so much from you? The first time I met you, Professor Galbraith, was when I went with you to a dinner at the Institute of Politics last spring. Aside from your 6 feet, 9-inch height, and distinguished appearance, there's one thing that I'll remember most from that evening. After the dinner, I brought Professor Galbraith and his wife, Kitty, back to their home. As I was leaving, he told me to wait. He went into his study, brought out one of his new books then, The Socially Concerned Today, signed it, and gave it to me. I told him, thank you very much for the gift, and said he was too kind. He replied, in essence, it is our duty to care about others. Those few words have remained with me since. Yes, Professor Galbraith has been an educator for over 50 years. Yes, Professor Galbraith is the author of over 40 books. And yes, Professor Galbraith was the ambassador to India. But through all of this, his teachings, books, public service, what Professor Galbraith has taught the world is that economics is a larger human project. He broke out of the mold and showed that it isn't simply output and productivity, but its combination with human happiness that truly matters. Professor Galbraith has taught, is teaching, and will continue to teach us all the lesson that we should always strive to attain. In politics and as humans, we must have compassion for each other. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many notable people in the audience tonight, and I know that many of them would like to speak, but if we invited even half of them who would like to speak, we would be here through the entire night and well into the weekend. So we have prepared a videotape of reminiscences, recollections of some of the special friends of Ken Galbraith. And let me at this point credit Laurie Conway, the producer, for putting this videotape together. And as they say, let's go to the videotape.
Many years ago, I was stuck in Hoboken, New Jersey, in a dirty and greasy garage. And the mechanic asked me, what did I do? I said, I taught at Harvard. And he was under the car, and a muffled voice came out and said, do you know Ken Galbraith? That convinced me that he was probably the most famous professor at Harvard.
John Kenneth Galbraith is very famous indeed. He's at once iconoclast, opinion maker, and political economist. He is ambassador and family man, writer and public servant. We've asked a few of his friends, admirers, his son Peter and granddaughter Katie, to talk about him. Here's what they have to say about the man born 90 years ago in Iona Station, Canada.
Well, first of all, he's intimidating, isn't he? I mean, all you have to do is stand in his presence and you're readily intimidated. And his size alone causes him to look down upon all of us mere mortals.
I know Bill Buckley won't altogether agree with me because he's a great exception, but on the whole, conservatives are self-righteous, solemn, pompous, and filled with indignation. Some liberals are that way, God knows, but more of them are in the manner of Ken. That is, they are working hard for things, they have objectives in mind, they're fighting hard for them, but at the same time, though they take their objectives seriously, they do not take themselves seriously.
There's no friend that I'd rather have than Ken Galbraith, and there's no enemy I would fear more than Ken Galbraith. His tongue's a killer, but Ken Galbraith is the funniest man I ever saw, ever knew. He's the most irreverent man I ever knew.
I think all of us who have been in Ken's company have memories that we cherish. Mine include his marches through the Vermont woods with younger, theoretically more fit senators following behind him, gasping for breath, trying to keep up an economic discussion as their wind ran out and great huge branches slapped back from Ken's forging ahead.
I think he's still absolutely unashamed of living by high ideals in a sort of low-ceiling world, and that is commendable when so many people shrink from liberal values and liberal ideals. Here's a man who's lived by them for 90 years and who articulates them with as much force now as he did 40 years ago.
I think the striking thing about John Kenneth Galbraith is that what you see is what there is, and there isn't some different private family persona that's different from the public persona.
I mean, it's incredible to have a grandfather that you can ask about Kennedy and Ho back in the days when he was president. I mean, this is obviously from my perspective as a younger generation member, but it's just extraordinary to be able to ask questions like that and get those incredible answers.
Although long retired from teaching, Mr. Galbraith can still be found in his study in Cambridge, writing 2 to 3 hours a day. His towering figure remains a presence passing through Harvard Yard.
He strides about. He's very much observable, not because only of his height, but because of the demeanor and the conduct and the alertness and the sort of tenacity of mind, the occasional wonderful acerbity, the constant humility, always in evidence.
He's been associated with the company for nearly 50 years. He's published over 30 books with us, at least one national bestseller. I can't think of anybody else in Houghton Mifflin history who's played such a major role in our publishing history.
And he turned out books faster than I could read them.
I've always been annoyed at him at his literary capacity, just churning out good books. I mean, he describes himself as getting up in the morning and writing 10 pages and so on and so forth. Well, any of us who try to write hate anybody who does that and is successful at it and then has the temerity to tell us all how to do it.
Beginning in the 1930s as a protege of John Maynard Keynes and continuing into his wartime position as FDR's price czar, Galbraith emerges as America's preeminent advocate of socially responsible economic policy. It's a position solidified by his 1950s bestseller, The Affluent Society.
That book made him as close to a household name as any economist could ever be. His galvanizing book asked the reader to look on the darker side of a society thought to be uniformly comfortable and indeed affluent. It stressed economic and cultural imbalances and alleged a loss of moral memory in many who were satisfied by American progress.
Ken is not an economist. He is a political economist. That was what economists used to be. That's what Malthus was. That's what Kenneth is. He sees economics in terms of its impact on people.
He has always understood that that government has to help those in need rather than those who have much, as Franklin Roosevelt once said in 1936 in his inaugural.
But I think his notion of the human actor as a public servant and the corporate mutual responsibility that we bear for one another, not simply as cogs in a great state system, but as mutual burden bearers taking responsibility. That's an articulated vision not often seen or heard.
I don't believe in fretting or grieving, why mess around with strife?
While serving as Kennedy's ambassador to India, he built a collection of Indian art, later donated to Harvard. India also shaped a view of Asia that led him to oppose America's deepening involvement in Vietnam.
He likes to say that being an ambassador is like being an airlines pilot, that there are hours and hours of boredom and minutes of panic. And it's during, no doubt, those hours of boredom, not the minutes of panic, that he spent looking at art. He takes particularly naughty delight in attracting people's attention to the more salacious and erotic aspects of these paintings.
To push his views with Kennedy, and there was a Galbraith alert among people here that he was coming home and that they all better be watch out for this, because he pushed his views so hard. Actually, I think Kennedy listened to him, but weighed this carefully with others and what he thought.
I remember in 1968, there was a campaign for Hubert Humphrey, and Arthur Schlesinger and Ken Galbraith and I were invited to speak at a rally. And just as he rose to speak, a woman, stark naked, came running down the aisle with a pig's head, and presumably in protest for Humphrey's position on Vietnam or whatever against Johnson, and threw it at the feet of Ken Galbraith as he was about to begin this broadcast to a national audience. And he looked down rather nonchalantly, looked around and said, "Have you left anything behind?"
Galbraith was never behind, always ahead, which even earned him the title Honorary Woman.
We've often dubbed Ken an honorary woman, and I think you can see he's an honorary feminist because he doesn't shrink when we tell him he's an honorary woman.
It's wonderful, it's marvelous, you should care for me.
Mr. Galbraith's wit and conviction were the distinguishing characteristic of his Harvard teaching. His classes were described in the Crimson's Confidential Guide as harangues followed by question periods in which hapless students either serve up items to support his theories or are wittily and thoroughly demolished for failing to do so.
There was a terrible story, a very funny story about my daughter Lally, because she went to his class for a while and then he noticed she dropped out, but she came to the house. And he said, "Lally, I haven't seen you in my class recently. Where have you been?" And she said, "Well, Professor Galbraith, I'm terribly sorry, but I find Perry Miller drunk better than you are sober."
The practice of government also was a part of Professor Galbraith's teaching agenda. At a time when professional training for public service was a radical idea at Harvard, he helped found the Kennedy School of Government.
As we came under attack from all quarters, Ken was always there in every instance, without reserve. Partly he likes a radical idea in general, that's been his character, but he understands government matters, and it matters critically.
Inside the university, he's also been an influential member of the economics department because he's represented a kind of a stream of paying attention to the real world, being concerned about social issues, and also being a critic of the academic community.
It's marvelous that you should care for me.
Through it all, John Kenneth Galbraith never stood alone. Catherine, his wife of 61 years, always was there. Kitty is his dearest friend, confidant, and mother to their children.
They have been companions in their travels both around the world and through life from the moment they got married.
She has been a part of his life. She's, I think, the joy of traveling and seeing the world. They're always together.
I was in the unfortunate situation of having to codify the Harvard's first rules on sexual harassment. And one of the rules had to do with not having, I think I said, amorous relations, or something of that kind. An unfortunate phrase. If I had known that Galbraith would read this, I probably would have used a different phrase. with students. He wrote me a letter saying that he was terribly upset because some 50 years earlier he had fallen in love with a student when he was, I think, a teaching fellow or an assistant professor, and he didn't know now whether he was living in a state of grave violation and what should he do.
So I think all of us who have had the benefit of his friendship, and of Kitty too, regard them as two of the most important friends that anyone could have.
For me, Ken has been a gift, perhaps the largest gift I've received in my lifetime. So Ken, thanks, and I hope that you have a marvelous and happy birthday.
I've known him since 1943, that's 55 years. And throughout, he's been a constant joy, stimulus. I've learned a great deal from him, and not just about economics either. And I treasure him.
Ken, it's your old friend Angie Dickinson here. And unfortunately, I'm here and not there to join with everybody to show you their love on your birthday. Happy 90th, my darling. I miss you and Kitty very, very much. I don't see you enough, and I regret I can't be there to give you that special hug and that special kiss on your birthday. Happy, happy birthday, and everybody have a wonderful time with my dear friend, Ken. God bless you, sweetheart.
Professor Galbraith has served as an inspiration to countless leaders, policymakers, and public servants. And I'm proud to call him an inspiration to me as well. And I'm very grateful for his service to our nation and for his rich contribution to American life and letters. So, happy birthday and God bless.
Had this terrible fall and almost died from hemorrhaging. It seemed, and he was, after all, what, I suppose 88 when this happened, or at least 89, I mean. And he has come back, and he looks like nothing ever happened to him. And now here he is, at 90. It's wonderful.
I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Ken, you have earned the respect and admiration of people all around the world, the deep affection of your colleagues, friends, and families. Congratulations on yet another notable accomplishment, your 90th birthday. I must say, to all of us who admire you, you will always seem forever young.
I see friends shaking hands, saying how they do. They're really saying, I love you.
And so, John Kenneth Galbraith, as we share your 90th birthday, we take this opportunity to thank you for your extraordinary contributions to Harvard, to America, and to the world. That's the way it is indeed.
Yes, I think to myself, what a
That wonderful video tribute was put together by Laurie Conway, and that voice, that marvelous voice, belonged to Walter Cronkite, as I think most of you know. It is perhaps appropriate that a member of the family for which this school is named and with whom Ken Galbraith has enjoyed a very long friendship should now come and offer his own special toast. So, John Kennedy, come forth, please.
Happy birthday, Ken. I've had the singular privilege of knowing Ken Galbraith virtually my entire life. He was one of my father's closest friends and a valued advisor throughout the administration. Back then, I knew him just as the largest man that I had ever seen. He was a profound influence on the president and challenged him in many ways, from my father's days as a undisciplined Harvard freshman through his years in the White House. He aided in the '60 campaign, helped with the inaugural address, advised him on Cuba, Vietnam, India, especially India, public spending, poverty, the arts, cigars, the Red Sox, or whatever subject he felt like advising. Once the president told an aide of Ken's rather critical assessment of administration policy during the crisis in Laos, the aide asked, quote, was that opinion solicited or unsolicited? The president smiled and said, "You know Galbraith, his opinions never require a formal invitation." Once, when Ken complained to the president that the New York Times wrote an article about him as the ambassador to India and called him arrogant, my father said, "Why not, Ken? Everyone else does." I think my father admired Ken because, of course, his sheer intellect, his humor, his sense of irony, and their shared delight at an exquisite rendering of an English sentence, and the fact that he would feel free to give my father 9 kinds of hell if he felt he deserved it. Once the president showed Ken a speech he was going to deliver about cuts in non-defense spending and asked him what he thought about it. Ken read it and said, "Mr. President, it's the finest Republican speech since McKinley." In my family, my father's affection for Ken was exceeded only perhaps by my mother. She made sure that Carolyn and I regularly saw Ken and Kitty growing up. And once, when I had given her a dreadful English composition I had written to proofread, she dropped to the table and said, "You only need to read 2 things to learn how to write. One is the King James Bible, the other is anything by Ken Galbraith." She was his biggest fan. Once, when she was in Greece, the paparazzi snapped some pictures of her sunbathing in the Buff. And she was attending a party in Manhattan when the pictures were published virtually everywhere. Everyone was a little nervous about it, and especially when she walked in, they were on eggshells. Until Ken strode up and said, "Hello, Jackie, I hardly recognized you with your clothes on." But after all his university degrees and his experience in academics and politics at the highest level, perhaps it was Ken's father who had the greatest influence on me. I had just learned that Ken's father was a farmer and a teacher who had great interest in politics and was the most outspoken liberal in his community. Ken once said, quote, "My father thought we were obliged because of our enormous size to alter the world to our specifications." So Ken, thanks to your wit, your grace, your intelligence, your crusader's heart, your fierce soul, the world has indeed grown, but it is unlikely to ever match your stature. Happy birthday.
Wow. While the cake is being served, and other dessert and coffee, the evening, of course, would not be complete without a comment from a member of the Galbraith family. The decision has been made that the youngest of his three sons, Professor James Galbraith, will offer a birthday toast to his father. Professor Galbraith is continuing in his father's tradition of academic excellence at the University of Texas in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Professor Galbraith, please.
Thank you, and I bring greetings to the Kennedy School from a sister institution. Let me first introduce myself. I'm the son who took the professorship. And I would like to introduce and acknowledge my brother Peter, who gave the family toast 5 years ago. He's the one who took the ambassadorship. And I'd like to introduce my brother Alan, who gave the toast 10 years ago at an occasion co-hosted by Mrs. Kennedy. Alan is older and wiser. He's the one who took the 3 kids who would all graduate from Harvard. I have often hoped that I would someday have a chance to refer to my father as that great economist whose contributions could be said to rival those of Keynes and Mill, with particular reference to John, Neville, and James. Tonight, I find I had that opportunity, but I lack the nerve. John Kenneth Galbraith has often been called here tonight a Renaissance man, a man of all parts, a man for all seasons, a great writer, teacher, diplomat, and public man. But I want tonight to toast him as an economist. In John Kenneth Galbraith, we have the economist of this American century, of the consumer society, of the corporate state, of the industrial and the post-industrial age. We have in John Kenneth Galbraith a man who has spawned and led many movements of criticism and reform, movements for social awareness and change. He is the economist of the consumer movement, of the environmental movement, of the peace movement, and even of the women's movement. In this way, I suggest he has risen to the highest calling of the economics profession. And so I predict that when the roll of the great reform economists is called, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, Thorstein Veblen, John Maynard Keynes, that the name of John Kenneth Galbraith will be on that list, and I ask you to toast John Kenneth Galbraith, a great economist, first and foremost.
Thank you. A few years ago, when William Buckley was asked to speak here and did the Theodore H. White lecture, and I found out about the special relationship that existed between Buckley and Galbraith, I asked Ken if he wouldn't mind introducing Buckley. He seized the opportunity, did a glorious job, and you suddenly had these 2 terrific minds representing 2 quite distinctly different political points of view gathering together in total friendship. Bill Buckley, would you come up, sir?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kalb, Kitty. Ever since I had the good fortune to meet Professor Galbraith, which is to be distinguished from the jolt some of us get from reading some of the things he writes. I have found him an omnipresence in books, articles, columns, movies, as in the op-ed that hit us all that recently last week in the New York Times. Galbraith's speak goes on all the time. Yesterday I received a volume entitled, quote, Proceedings 1994 to 1995 from the Churchill Center in Washington, and lo, in an introduction, mind you, to me, my own essay on Churchill, what do I run into? John Kenneth Galbraith. Introducing me, the editor wrote, in 1975, when Mr. Buckley first sailed the Atlantic, the New York Times reported that he had arrived in the Azores, to quote the Times, accompanied by John Kenneth Galbraith, celebrating his retirement from the Harvard faculty as part of the crew. Mr. Buckley immediately wrote the Times, the Galbraith on board was not my friend, the 6'11" emaciated Menshevik John Kenneth, but my friend, the chunky 5'10" Manchesterist Evan Galbraith, ambassador to France. And anyway, surely it was Harvard, not Professor Galbraith, that had reason to celebrate. Professor Galbraith, the narrator continues, had meanwhile also written the Times. William F. Buckley, Jr., he wrote, was boasting as usual. When he told you that I'd sailed to the Azores as a member of his crew, he is not that brave, nor, may I say, am I. But later, the introducer concluded that part of the story that involved our guest of honor. On reading Buckley's book-length account of the voyage, he wrote of it, Buckley takes me to sea, makes me part of the whole adventure. Mr. Buckley should give up politics and concentrate on writing. He cannot afford to have serious people think he is a failed politician when he is a master of a higher craft. That is a fine mix, pure Galbraith, the mordancy intact, the generosity making a cameo appearance. The careful hand of Mr. Galbraith in regulating the activity of his critics was never better dramatized than when, 5 years ago, I was invited to be one of 7 speakers at his 85th birthday party here in Boston. Our talks, quite understandably, were limited to 4 minutes per speaker. When my turn came, I got up in that vast Boston Public Library and had got through the first half of my tightly woven remarks when the master of ceremonies brusquely pushed me to one side, grabbed the microphone, and called out, "Is there a doctor in the house?" There was one, and after a minute or two, he was located and oriented in the direction of the afflicted. The microphone was replaced in my hands, and of course the beautiful sonnet I had woven was entirely fractured, like starting off Hamlet with the death of Ophelia. The next day I mailed a copy of my remarks to Professor Galbraith. I said in the covering sentence, Ken, you may not have heard my talk. The acoustics are very bad at the Boston Library, so I sent along a copy. A week later, I received his acknowledgement. It read, Dear Bill, that was a very pleasant talk you gave about me. If I had known it would be so, I would not have instructed my friend to pretend in the middle of your speech to need attention of a doctor. I'm here, of course, for very personal reasons. John Kenneth Galbraith quietly, discreetly engages us, as no doubt many in this room have found out for themselves, by his concern for his friends and students. A willingness that goes so far as to tell us what to think and say. I suspect that he is unaware that, however silently, there are those of us who observe him. Indeed, he continues to think of as invisible, unremarked, unremarkable. Maybe there is a marked explanation for this. Personal grace is inelastically noticeable. There are many here and many not here who have been encouraged by him and elevated by his example when he is not wearing his war paint. He can be deadly serious when acting simply as a friend. And in such moments, he detaches himself from workaday perspectives, philosophical and literary. The irony and the handling of paradox which in his hands make readable even abstruse thought and polemics. As I contemplate the company in which I am thrust tonight, I can only think that this is Ken's ironic contribution to that part of the First Amendment that guarantees against an establishment of religion. A common political religion that binds the speakers here tonight, save for one invincibly ignorant contrarian, who, while rejecting Galbraith's mansion, happily acclaims a great scholar and writer and a beloved personal friend.
Don't you all think that it's time to hear from Ken? Ken Galbraith, it's your evening. Come forth.
Well, I begin by telling you what you already know, that no one has enjoyed an evening as much as I have this evening. Sorry, Bill, I exclude you. A great concentration on the ultimate truth of our time. Oh, you missed that. But let me go on, but very briefly, because while I say it is fragile, it cannot be extended to 60 minutes. To my pleasure, we gather to celebrate tonight a certain continuity in human existence. There are no doubt problems in the survival of 90 years. Great age is not uniformly a benign experience. However, I am fully persuaded that it is much better than the alternative. There is further advantage in continuity. It is now 61 years and exactly 1 month since I married Catherine Atwater, who joins me here tonight. That has all been quite wonderful. "65 years ago this autumn, I joined the Harvard faculty. I have been here off and on ever since, though some quite possibly favored the off rather more than the on. All this has been good. Harvard, when I arrived here, had some of the air of a distinguished finishing school for the Boston and New York self-anointed elite. It is now a truly international university. The acknowledged world leader, diligent and brilliant students were once dismissed as the greasy grinds. They are now the norm. Women were then excluded from classes and quarantined when in the library. They are now fully present and possibly dominant. And I hasten to say, we have now Neil Rudenstein as president. Let me note that along with the well-loved members of the Galbraith clan from Canada, and there has long been a feeling that the Galbraiths, more properly known in the Highlands as the Galbraiths, are somewhere between a clan and an affliction. Along with the well-loved members of the Galbraith clan from Canada, the President and Vice Chancellor of my undergraduate college is here tonight. He leads what is now the University of Guelph, one of the greatly distinguished research universities of the continent. I'm delighted that he has been with us this evening. There is also a most agreeable continuity as regards my publisher, one of our hosts on this wonderful evening. It is now approaching half a century, 46 years to be exact, since the distinguished and happily independent Boston firm of Houghton Mifflin published my first book. Our relationship has been comprehensively rewarding. Where publishers are involved and their compensation, I fully accept and approve the market system. But there has been much more than that. These years have given me an intellectually rewarding relationship with some of the most literate and widely intelligent people I have ever known. And I ask what other author can claim so long and so amiable a relationship with his or her publisher. How different the literary expression of this country would be if all authors enjoyed a similar relationship. Finally, I share birthday celebrations on this favored evening with Arthur Schlesinger, who also celebrates tonight his birthday. He is my best loved friend and my indispensable tutor for more than half a century. Likewise, Roy and Jennifer Jenkins are here, and I can only also tell you of my love. And I particularly mention the presence tonight of George McGovern and William Buckley, reflecting our careful balance always between what is right and what is wrong. But let me add one other word. What is brilliantly right and brilliantly wrong. Skiing once with Bill some years ago. It was spring. The weather was bad. There were breaks in the snow. He made an accomplished run down the slope. I had some difficulty. I came quite a bit behind Bill. He noticed the awkwardness of my performance and said, "Ken, how long have you been skiing?" I decided I would give him nothing, and I said 30 years. And he said, "Just the length of time you've been studying economics." I have two final observations. When we met 5 years ago, some of us, quite a few of us, I complained that evening about what I called the still syndrome. I encounter it every day. Are you still healthy? Are you still writing? I hadn't realized that you were still alive. In these last years, however, I've found an effective response. I recommend it to all here of my age or close thereto. When you hear that, say in a kindly way, aren't you still somewhat immature? My final observation. 5 years from tonight, I will see you all here again at the Kennedy School, which we all rightly admire. I think we will all agree and hope that Joe Nye, a wonderfully and diversely qualified leader, will still be dean. Once at sundown, people at Harvard went home or to their rooms. Now, when the sun goes down, they come here to the Kennedy School where life never stops. So it will be 5 years from now, and I end on a further optimistic note. 5 years from now, classes in this great school will still, notice the word, will still deal with politics and political history, with economic policy and economic history, with social welfare achievement, and with other subjects bearing on the art and practice of government. It is my optimistic thought of the evening that there will then be no course on sex. Thank you very much.
No birthday party is complete without the presentation of gifts. Not many, but meaningful gifts. And the first is going to be presented by the team of Gloria Steinem and Arthur Schlesinger. So please come forward.
Well, having heard everything that you've heard this evening, you will not be surprised to learn that Arthur and I have been inveigled into embarking on the second oldest profession, fundraising. And that is why we want to tell you about it this evening. But I want to say thank you to Ken and Kitty for 39 years of friendship, and both of you for always looking at the world as if everyone mattered. I'm looking for a role model because I hope to stay alive and kicking until 100 and writing. And Ken, I'm counting on you.
Thomas Carlyle, who unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, once characterized economists as respectable professors of the dismal science. Had he lingered sufficiently to attend to the 42 books and several thousand articles and interviews of his fellow Scotsmen, he would have had to acknowledge that in the hands of unrespectable professors, economics can produce wit and merriment. And more than that, wit and merriment can awaken us all to deeper truths about society and about ourselves. Ken uses the whiplash phrase and the sardonic thrust for particular purposes, to reconnect economics with human and social reality, to rebuke the apostles of selfishness and greed, and to give the less fortunate of our world a better break in life. And he's accomplished these purposes with magnificent success. Nor can we forget Kitty, who has provided the unswerving affection and support that have made the Galbraith household forever welcoming and the best fun around. Now to business.
As the first of several gifts we are presenting to Ken, Arthur and I, we are pleased to announce the establishment of the John Kenneth Galbraith Fund, a permanent endowed fund at Harvard University.
Annual earnings from this endowment will be used to provide support for students known as Galbraith Fellows, who we trust will be inspired by Ken Galbraith's commitment to scholarship, public service, political and intellectual activism, and humane ideals. As part of the fund, through the support of the National Science Foundation, the Kennedy School, and its Wiener Support for Social Policy, we'll launch a new summer institute to train the next generation of scholars and practitioners in the study of social and economic inequality. These students will be known as the Galbraith Fellows. The first cohort will attend the Kennedy School in the summer of 1999.
We especially want to thank the very many donors who have supported the Galbraith Fund in its early stages, and they are noted in the insert card of your program, and we hope that you will tell us if there are other names that would like to join them. We're pleased to announce that the fund has raised over $625,000 to date through advance gifts.
The Galbraith Fund will allow Ken's enduring legacy to live on at Harvard and in the country and in the world for all future generations. Happy birthday, Ken.
Now it's time for a surprise, a very special presentation, and it is going to be made by Lord Jenkins of Hillhead. Lord Jenkins is the Chancellor of Oxford University, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, member of the House of Lords, and founder of the Social Democratic Party in the United Kingdom. Lord Jenkins, please.
My task tonight is simple, and you will be relieved to hear, at this stage in the proceedings, fairly brief. It is to present to Ken Galbraith the book of essays about his personality and his works, which has been compiled by his devoted London agent of many years' standing, Helen Sasson, who, like Thomas Carlyle, but for different reasons, cannot be here tonight. It is a very good festschrift of 16 essays. I have the advantage of being almost the only person here, apart from its publisher, who has read them all. A proof copy was delivered to me when I arrived in Cambridge at 2 p.m. yesterday. I finished the 187 pages at 7 o'clock this morning. Coming from London, one wakes up rather early. Nonetheless, it is a tribute to their readability as well as to my assiduity. From at least five of them, I derived new knowledge as well as pleasure and amusement. An anonymous number, even though not chosen randomly, is always wise in such a context, because all 16 can believe they belong to it, they're included with it. But however, all the other 11 are well worth reading and admiring without being hagiographic. I remember George Ball, the beginning of the 80th birthday speeches in New York 10 years ago, setting the ball rolling, I think that is the appropriate phrase, by saying that what he most admired amongst Ken's manifold qualities was his humility. On reading these essays, Ken will find that quality somewhat, but not unduly strained. I've known Ken Galbraith for 45 years, exactly half his own life, and nearly 60% of my own. I first went to dinner at 30 Francis Avenue on the 16th, not the 15th, of October 1953. I suppose people he knew better were then invited on the 15th of October. Since then, over that now quite long period, the warm glow of being a friend of Galbraith has made an immense difference to my life, above all in its American dimension, but also in its British and international one too. I give two recent, disparate examples. At the beginning of this week, Tony Blair asked me to see him today about some trivial domestic matter of changing the British voting system. I said it was impossible. I was committed to Ken Galbraith's birthday party. He immediately withdrew, giving me, he said, a particular message from me. And as I cannot remember what it was, I cannot do so. But it was certainly, in my firm recollection, both friendly and even reverential. And yesterday, at Logan Airport, the immigration official expressed mild suspicion, or at least interest, in the shortness of our 36-hour visit. I thought it was the equivalent of being arrested for driving too slowly. What are you going to do, he said. I answered resonantly, make a speech at the 90th birthday of Professor John Kenneth Galbraith. Well, isn't that something, he said, and practically fell on his knees. I seem to remember him coming through, he said. Isn't he a fairly tall man? Well, rather, I said, though he's lost 1 or 2 inches recently. But I regard them as two good examples, two good brackets of the impact upon me of knowing Galbraith. Now, I concluded my speech at Ken's 80th birthday celebrations in New York 10 years ago by saying how much I was looking forward to doing so again at his 90th. There was, I suppose, an element of spitting into the wind about it, and I must confess that there have been times in the past decade when I thought I had been rash. But here he is again, marvelously and indomitably restored to health. So much so that I am tempted to cast hopes further forward. I won't test fate too much, but we, Jennifer and I, will guarantee to come back for his 95th. And now it only remains for me to give him the proof copy, symbolic proof copy of this festschrift, which I have no doubt will be produced in even more handsome form within a few weeks.
Thank you. And now the final gift, at least the final gift this evening in this environment, is going to be presented by our distinguished Dean Donai. Sir.
No speech, but a final gift to Ken from his many friends at Harvard, President Rudenstein, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Jeremy Knowles, who's here, Provost Harvey Feinstein, who's here, Feinberg's here, and all the friends that Ken has on the faculty here at the Kennedy School. And this is a graphic presentation by the artist Ken Kosofsky. And Ken, you will see some things I think you will recognize. I want to thank you all for attending, to tell you that this is a rare treat, a special honor for all of us, and we'll welcome you all back here in 5 years, the 95th. Good night and happy birthday again.